The push to legalize and tax the raw, smokable form of medical marijuana was backed by the State House today. The bill would let the state's licensed producers sell the smokable form to the state's 9 pharmacies that can sell medical marijuana. That now heads to the state Senate, and if it's passed, experts say it would bring in about $1.7 million in tax revenues initially, ramping up to about $12 million by 2026.
But there are some Republican lawmakers that are willing to go even further, legalizing recreational pot. Now, Representative Richard Nelson, who's a Republican from Mandeville, sponsored a bill to legalize marijuana for adults to use and tax it. Now, this would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue. The bill moved through a committee and is now heading to the House floor for debate.